Hey everybody, Sleepy Reader here. This is my first comic book thoughts video in many a week. I just kept getting further and further behind, and I kept saving up piles of comics that I wanted to talk about. I wish I could talk about every comic book that I read. It's just my reading diary, I guess. So I'm going to try and jam a ton of stuff into a few comic book thoughts videos for now. So this one, I've picked out a bunch of comics that I've been reading, all of which are fantasy. Immersive fantasy, you might say. That's what I tend to call it, where you have a fantasy world that's not our world and you're deep inside of it. A lot of it can be what they used to call high fantasy. I'm not sure what they call it now. I've read a lot. I've always read fantasy novels all my life. These are fairly recent ones. This is an older one that I've only discovered recently. Glenn Cook, awesome. Roger Zelazny's The Amber novels. I used to buy them in little thin paperbacks, but now I have all 10 books in one book. Love that. All kinds of, these are just a few examples. But so I'm a long experienced fantasy reader. That's what I'm trying to say, at least in prose. Only recently have there been many fantasy movies, really. Lord of the Rings being the main one. And I don't know, I guess maybe at least going back to ElfQuest, we've had the kind of deep fantasy comic book, but it feels like they were a lot less common in the past. Maybe Conan and his imitators were the main thing we had for a long time. But right now there's been, maybe with the image boom in particular, there's been a lot of fantasy novels, fantasy comics. And what I'm realizing about it, and it's probably true with fantasy novels and short stories too, but I just somehow have noticed it more in this reading comic books in this serial fashion, is there's something very subtle about fantasy where it either works for you or it doesn't. And you can't say, well, it's because I don't like books about talking animals, or I do like books about talking animals, or I don't like books about guys with big swords, or I do. I mean, it's a very touchy thing for me. I'm finding that it's really hard to put my finger on why some work and some don't. For instance, I love the Autumnlands. I would not think I was a talking animal guy. I mean, I read Watership Down a bazillion years ago, but it wasn't my cup of tea, and I don't generally do talking animal fantasy novels. That being said, Commandy, of course, is one of my favorite science fiction comics. And this has its roots in Commandy and Jack Vance and other fantasy novels. And it takes its damn time. On the surface, it's slow moving, and it's slowed down since the first arc. And clearly we're now going to meander the countryside and have adventures a la Commandy, but in a much slower paced fashion. A la lots of serialized stories. Although we still have, hovering over the whole thing, the question of who this guy is, and is he really the person who brought magic to the world, and can he bring magic back to the world? And I think we'll slowly explore the nature of magic in the world and all the societies in this world. And everything I read in here hits me as just right, and I just keep wanting to read. Not a lot happened in this issue 9, but it, as part of the piece of the larger whole, I really loved it. The art, of course, is continuing to be great. This guy, Benjamin Dewey, just really knows how to make the animals work in this visual medium. There's nothing Warner Brothers Looney Tunes about these animals. But anyway, so this is one of my favorite current comics, in my top 5 for sure. But it's probably not to everyone's taste, so I can't say why it seems to me to do everything just right. But it does, and I love it. Mostly just right, or a right in a lot of ways, and again, I can't put my finger on it, is Saints. Actually, this breaks, I said it's all immersive fantasy, but I guess I've mixed in other kinds of fantasy. This is a a world much like ours, but where the saints come back as magical heroes, and they're pursued by. And that's where I kind of fall down. Who is it that's pursuing them? Some kind of evangelicals who want to bring about the apocalypse, so they want there to be an antichrist, and so they're fighting against the saints. And I don't quite understand their reasoning there. And this issue, so I've really loved or really enjoyed a lot this series, but this issue is the issue where I kind of lost the thread a teeny bit. So I'm hopeful the next issue will pull me back in, and worried the next issue will spin me out and I will be lost. I think I saw in solicits, 3 or 4 months in advance from now, that they're starting to say, what's the issue number on here? This is issue 5. They're starting to say like 5 out of 12 or whatever. So they've decided maybe the sales have been good enough to finish the story, but not to make this an ongoing. So I think there's 12 issues in this. But so it is, this one's kind of on the cusp where, if, for me as a reader, if they can maintain most of the good stuff they've been doing, they'll keep me. But they could lose me quickly. And that seems to me the nature of fantasy, at least in comics. Probably in novels too, but novels you kind of absorb in one chunk and you either decide the novel worked for you or it didn't. Whereas in a comic book, the story's being piecemealed out to you month by month, and you're slowly deciding, does this story work for me or does it not? And it seems to be in the nature of modern fantasy, immersive fantasy, that they tend to be long-form stories. I think 12 issues for Saints will be a good length, if I'm right about that. But a lot of other stories go a lot longer. Case in point, BPRD Hell on Earth, number 139. And I don't know where this story really starts. I started reading it 17 issues ago. And it feels like there's at least like 50 issues before it with important information that I don't have, even though issue 22, where I dropped on, I've got 2 issues of it here, was listed as a jumping on point. I've enjoyed the BPRD Hell on Earth out of it. There's been lots of great stuff, but there's, in these 2 issues, there's lots of characters that I still don't know who they are or what their relationship to everything is, like the characters in this scene. I mean, I kind of get they're at the BPRD headquarters and they're doing something mystical that is going to affect this guy, the Black Flame's powers. I don't really know who the Black Flame is. He's a bad guy. He has something to do with the Hell on Earth stuff, but he's not the whole story behind it. And he has some relation with Liz, the girl with fire powers. But these were great issues, full of cool stuff. I just had to put aside every now and then. So this, every now and then, wishing I knew the full story. And I think I think they're near the end. I think they might be ending BPRD or BPRD on Hell in a few issues. I feel like I read that somewhere online. And I'll stick to the end to it, and then I will probably start looking for all those issues I missed to fill it back in. And then I'll get a new excitement. It's kind of like when I was a kid and I first read the Amber novels. I think I started with the second novel. I didn't know what it was. It was called The Guns of Avalon. I just picked it up. It was really cool, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of other stories. But that one did a lot better job of filling me in more fully on who all the characters were. They're really reluctant to tell you in any way. They just, characters are there, they talk, and then they're gone. It's the modern comic to the nth degree. There's this tiny explanation at the beginning, which has been relatively the same in all the 17 issues I've read. It goes back to some information from tens of more issues before then. It doesn't fill you in as you go along. So the BPRD Hell on Earth is a frustrating delight, but an example of, and I'm calling this an immersive fantasy world just because it's a future Earth that's gone literally to hell. But I suppose it has some link to our world, but it's an immersive fantasy world to me, and it's immerses me in the right way. Except for they just, because this serial nature of comics, they just could be a little nicer to me about filling me in. Just tag characters. That would just be great. Say so-and-so, psychic from birth, has had a terrible time in the past few years. Okay, so you guys I think I managed to do a video somewhere where I raved about Monstrous #1. And Monstrous 2 and 3 I read in a row. Beautiful objects, as you can see just by the covers. Love the art. Incredible numbers of cool things going on in the story with these arcanics versus the humans and the weird moral areas and these incredibly evil characters. And maybe our heroine is even an incredibly evil character, and maybe her mother was. And this cat with 2 tails who can talk and has little pouches that carries magic things in it and stuff. And loads of other details. You can sense there's this really cool, immersive fantasy world here. But it's losing me. I don't know whether to pick up another issue or just wait and read it in trades. Maybe it'll be easier to follow what's going on. It's losing me in terms of sympathy, too. I don't have anything to hang on here. I mean, even an evil character to sympathize with, if you know what I mean. Sometimes you can say, oh, yeah, I understand why that person's so mad, or he's delightfully evil, or she's delightful. It's all female characters in here, which is interesting. And in terms of wanting to support a book, I want to support this because it's a beautiful comic book. But as a story, it's just not holding me. Maybe I'll figure out when the first trade cutoff point is and just get those issues and then switch to trades. Because I've certainly committed quite a bit of time to this story already. But there, for instance, at the end of, along with just sort of something not quite gripping me about this story, they also, but in a different way from BPRD, are not giving me as much information as I'd like. So at the end of issue 2, something happens in this kind of vague picture. And then it was only, this one does have an explanation of what came before, and I learned in what came before that this thing came out of the stump of her arm. You can't even tell in this picture that's what's happening. If you skipped that what came before thing, it would be very hard to follow that sequence. And there were characters who sort of appeared, and I was like, okay, I eventually figured out this character here, cloaked, is later this character here, maybe with her cloak off. It was just very unclear who these characters were, and to tell from one page to the next that this was the same character. So that just adds to my difficulty reading this. Again, it may not be as hard in trades. I might pick up more of the clues and remember them more. So yeah, this is on the cusp for me, which is really sad because as a fantasy fan, it has so much going for it. The Exodus, The Life After, is losing me a bit too, and I loved this in its first volume when it was just called The Life After. And there's still great stuff here, but it's like I'm having, I don't know, it's just a little less grippy. Here, the immersive fantasy world is a fantasy version of limbo or purgatory and hell and heaven and God and the bureaucrats of the devil. I don't know if we've actually met the devil or not, but now we've met God, who's a floating potato. And I don't take this to be serious religious commentary or an expression of any religious point of view, really, so much as using the mythology to create his own mythology. It's funny, to me, this floating potato keeps looking kind of like a thumb. And I find that disconcerting, a floating stub of a thumb. So it's still funny and entertaining, but it's not like as special to me. It's lost its groove a bit. so that, yeah, and it doesn't, before, although I couldn't predict at all where it went, as it went places, it was like, oh yeah, this is where it has to go. But now it just feels like it could go anywhere. I think I'll still keep getting it. It's a little rough when it's less than perfect and it's a $4 book. Again, makes it tempting to follow in trades. If there's going to be like a third season of this after Exodus, like the last one I think lasted 7 or 8 issues, I might switch to trade at that point. Rumble is a fantasy story. I guess maybe it's supposed to be in some version of the real world with a fantasy back world, but it just feels like we're immersed in this fantasy world. And it has this wonderful immersive art from James Herron. But I never have been totally into this. It was very slow moving at first and not giving much information. I was enjoying it for the art. And the backstory seemed a little cliched. Now the fantasy story, which isn't so much in the background now, is more in the foreground, feels more unique, but still not super grippy. And I think it's the art that's keeping me gripped to this for the most part. A lot of bloody scenes in this issue. And it's a $3.50 book. So fantastic art, pretty good fantasy story. I will meet fantasy stories. I will go a number of steps to meet fantasy stories. I've stuck with some of the fantasy comics, that eventually just faded away because no one else was sticking with them. And I'll probably stick with Rumble. Ragnarok, this is another really hard one. It's a $4 one. It's Walt Simonson, an artist that I have this, long-time love for, particularly his work for Thor. And this is his personal version of Norse mythology after Ragnarok, where Thor, kind of as this almost zombie corpse-like Thor, comes back and is trying to figure things out. But it started to lose me in this issue. It's kind of been up and down as it's gone along. But I really felt like I didn't care very much in this issue. There was some fight scenes and stuff and some revelations, and I just didn't find them very interesting. And it seems to promise just a big battle next issue. It's hard to stop. I don't know how many issues they plan to go with this. It's hard to stop 7 issues in. And, what if it's just like 3 or 4 more issues to end the story? But definitely, whatever that magic mix of things, it's leached away in this issue. Okay, and Limbo. Here's the latest 2 issues of Limbo. Let's see, 2 and 4. I don't know where issue 3 went. I kind of liked issue 1, and then but it felt a little bit of a cliched story about a detective who happened to be in a magical kind of world, a little, yet another take on the Hellblazer or Kolchak kind of story. But it's just become more and more unique and more immersive as we go on. I've really grown to love the artwork by Wingengard. At first I wasn't a big fan of it, and the coloring as I show it doesn't seem like the coloring that I normally like, but it's taken on a life of its own in my imagination, and I would be happy if this just went on and on, but apparently it's a 6-issue run, so maybe if it sells well in trades and stuff, they'll come back with another storyline, unless there's something at the end of issue 6 that ends it for good. But I assume not. I assume that limbo actually means we really are in limbo, kind of like in the afterlife, although I think a wholly different kind of idea about limbo. But in some dimension that is not our own dimension, where magic rules, magic that's kind of like voodoo and Cajun mythology, but also something else, and a lot of technology involved, kind of retro technology, as if technology of the 1980s with VHSs and cassette tapes and the like. If I seem distracted, it's because my computer keeps falling asleep on me. Okay, and finally in this stack of fantasy comics, I've got Headlopper number 2, which I really loved. It's like Conan and Adventure Time and Gru, which is kind of like Conan and Adventure Time, I suppose. But it just has its own quirky vibe and rhythm, plus really cool art, really cool coloring that just really worked for me. There's nothing amazingly unique in the actual details, with witches and giants and evil swamp gods and stuff, but it's just done in a way. It's a perfect example of it's just the right touch, at least for me, that enthralls me and makes me want to read some more. There was another comic book that was kind of either post-apocalyptic or fantasy. What was it called? I didn't pull it out, but it had a similar vibe to it was called Strayer. Somewhere in this stack I'm flipping through. It's called Strayer, and it's from Aftershock, and it's about this guy who fights giant monsters in an apocalyptic magical future for money, and he meets a young girl who has the solution or knows the solution to man's problems here in the future and wants his help. And there's kind of a comedy duo thing going on there, plus the fighting with the giant monsters. And it was pretty cool art and pretty fun dialogue and stuff, but somehow it just didn't click nearly as well as Headlopper, which is about a guy who goes around lopping off the heads of giant monsters usually. They even both have big beards, I think. So yeah, it's just that magic touch. Now, that having just the right touch is true with everything, I suppose, but it just seems like a stronger effect, at least for me, with fantasy. Like if these were science fiction, if the science fiction's done with a certain kind of rigor, you can sort of get through or get past whether it has just the right feel to it or the right touch. I mean, the more of a good narrative touch and art and everything that a science fiction comic or story has, the better too. But it just seems like the genre can carry it more. Or detective story, the genre can carry the story a little further. Whereas in a fantasy thing, the story can just slip away from you quickly if it just doesn't feel just right. So that's my thesis of this comic book thoughts. I hope I didn't end up sounding like a professor again. I hate it when people think I'm like a professor, because I hate my father, who's a professor. Talk to y'all later.